The storm gathers. The wind had begun its mournful song hours ago, but by twilight it had swelled into a full-throated howl. It screamed through the skeletal trees, rattled the shutters, and whipped snow into furious eddies that danced like ghosts outside Jack's cabin. The old spruce logs of the structure groaned under the weight of gathering frost, their joints creaking like tired bones. Inside, however, the fire in the hearth stood defiantly against the storm, casting a flickering golden glow over the worn floorboards and the mismatched furniture that bore the fingerprints of a solitary life. Jack sat in a faded armchair near the hearth, cradling a mug of black tea that steamed gently into the cold air. The heat never quite filled the corners of the cabin anymore, especially not in a winter like this. He had lived through many winters up here in the Highlands, most of them fierce, all of them long, but this one felt different. Harsher, hungrier, as though the land itself had grown mean. He sipped the tea slowly, savouring the warmth more than the flavour, and stared at the flames. They popped and crackled in rhythmic protest, throwing orange light across the lined planes of his face. Jack had grown used to the silence, the distance, the emptiness. Years ago, that silence had been a refuge. Now it was just a fact of life, as familiar as the daily ritual of chopping wood or scanning the radio for weather updates. A stack of firewood sat neatly by the hearth, a labour he took pride in. Everything in Jack's life was a product of his own hands now. The cabin, the furniture, even the thick wool socks on his feet. It was the kind of life that demanded self-sufficiency, but also one that crept into your bones with a weight that didn't always leave. Outside, the storm deepened. Snow slapped against the windows in angry bursts. Jack glanced toward the nearest one, squinting at the frozen swirl beyond. Somewhere out there the forest stood in silent vigil, cloaked in white and shadow. He imagined the pine trees bent low under the wind's fury, branches groaning, wildlife huddled in burrows and dens, riding out the storm as best they could. He set the mug down on the small table beside him, the wood scarred by years of use. His hands, thick and calloused, trembled slightly, not from fear but from age and time. He reached for a well-worn book but didn't open it. Instead he leaned back and closed his eyes, letting the sounds of the storm fill the space where music or conversation might once have lived. The cabin had not always been so quiet. Once long ago there had been voices here. Laughter, a second chair by the fire, not covered with a sheet and gathering dust. But that was another life, a life Jack rarely allowed himself to remember in more than fragmented flashes. A firelight smile, the smell of bread in the oven, a dog snoring near the hearth. All gone now. He exhaled and rubbed his hands together for warmth, the fire crackling as if in sympathy. Winter was unforgiving to everyone, but especially to the lonely. Jack stood and walked to the window, wiping away a thin circle of condensation with the sleeve of his sweater. The snow had buried his woodpile again. He'd have to dig it out in the morning, assuming the storm passed. He studied the swirling white beyond, hypnotized by its rhythm. He could barely make out the edge of the porch, where icicles clung like frozen daggers to the overhang. Then, scratch, scratch, he froze. The sound was faint, easily mistaken for a branch brushing the siding or snow sliding from the roof. Scratch, scratch, a pause. Then a low, keening whine, not the wind. Jack stiffened. His eyes flicked to the door, then back to the window. He leaned closer, trying to see through the storm. The world beyond the glass was a churning white wall. He waited, heart beginning to thud in his chest. There it was again. Softer this time, but unmistakable. A desperate, fragile sound that tugged at something deep inside him. Jack moved cautiously to the door, every step careful, deliberate. His boots made soft thumps on the wooden floor. He paused just before the threshold, listening. Scratch. Then silence. He unlatched the deadbolt and slowly pulled the door open. A blast of cold punched into the cabin, slicing through the warmth like a knife. Snow billowed in, and Jack raised a hand to shield his face. The storm screamed around him, but in the chaos he saw them. 2 wolves. They stood just beyond the edge of the porch, barely distinguishable from the snowdrifts that blanketed the world. Their fur was caked in ice and sleet, their bodies thin and trembling. One of them, smaller, favoured a front paw, holding it just off the ground. The larger one stood in front, muscles tight with tension, but it didn't growl. It didn't bare its teeth. It just stared at him. Their eyes met. In that single moment, Jack felt something he hadn't in years. Connection. Not fear, not surprise, but something older. Primal. Like a whisper carried from one heartbeat to another through the snow. He didn't know how long he stood there, barely breathing. The cold seeped into his bones, but he couldn't tear his eyes away. The wolves didn't move. They made no sound now. The smaller one whimpered softly, a high note of pain that pierced through the wind. Jack swallowed hard. His mind raced with instinct. Wolves were wild, dangerous. He should shut the door, let nature take its course. That was the rule of the woods, wasn't it? But something about their eyes, haunted, pleading, cut through the logic in his mind. He looked at the smaller one again, saw the way it leaned against its companion for support, the way it shivered. The larger wolf pressed back, sheltering it from the wind. Jack had seen that kind of loyalty once, years ago. He didn't realize his hand was moving until his fingers touched the latch. His breath clouded the air, a misty shroud that hung between him and the wolves. He hesitated, and then he opened the door wider. Faces in the snow. Jack stood in the doorway, the freezing wind biting at his face and hands, but he didn't move. The snow swirled violently around him, erasing the world beyond the porch into a canvas of white. But the two figures at the edge of that whiteout held his gaze, immovable and surreal. The wolves. Even in the chaos of the storm, they seemed carved from the forest itself, silent, watchful, weathered by survival. The larger one stood tall and alert, head slightly lowered, ears perked forward in caution. Snow clung to its coat in thick clumps, icicles dangling from its ruff like twisted jewelry. It didn't growl, didn't lunge, didn't bare its teeth. It simply stood there, meeting Jack's gaze with a kind of guarded dignity that made him hesitate. The smaller wolf, huddled beside it, was visibly weaker. Its legs trembled as it shifted its weight off a bloodied paw, and its ribs protruded sharply through a coat thinned by hunger and hardship. It leaned into the larger wolf like a child into an older sibling, relying on borrowed strength. For a long moment, no one moved. The wind roared around them, shaking the cabin's shutters and driving snow into Jack's face. He narrowed his eyes, squinting against the onslaught. Part of his brain screamed at him to shut the door, to go back to the fire and let the wild stay wild. But his hands didn't move, instead they trembled. The large wolf shifted forward slightly, just one step, tentative, almost questioning. Jack's fingers tightened around the doorframe. He could feel his heart beating against his ribs like a drum. These were wolves, wild animals, apex predators. What kind of madness was this? But their eyes, God, their eyes. Jack had hunted once, in another life. He knew the look of animals cornered, the fight or flight in their gaze. This was neither. The larger wolf's eyes weren't full of challenge. They were full of something else, pleading. Not for dominance or submission, for help. Jack took a breath that burned in his lungs. He lowered himself slowly, carefully, to one knee just inside the threshold. His movements were deliberate, non-threatening. He stretched out a hand, palm open. The wolves didn't move. The smaller one whimpered again, the sound barely audible above the wind. It was thin, pitiful, the cry of a creature in pain and on the edge of collapse. The bigger wolf's ears flicked back. Its tail didn't rise, but stayed low, curled against its hind legs in what Jack recognized as tension, not aggression. For some reason, that made his chest ache. Whatever this pair had been through to end up here at his door, it had broken something in them. And in him. He thought of the last time he had reached out to another soul. Not an animal, a person. Her name had been Elena. It had been years since she left, but the memories of that final winter together lived just beneath the surface of his skin. The smell of her shampoo lingering in the flannel sheets, her laugh echoing through the pines when she walked the trails behind the cabin, the way she'd pause at the window to watch snowfall collect on the railing. Her absence still hung in the rooms like an unfinished sentence. Elena would have opened the door. Jack felt the sting behind his eyes and blinked it away. The larger wolf took another slow step forward, paws sinking into the packed snow. It made no sound, only watched Jack with those steady, ancient eyes. "I don't know what you want from me," Jack murmured, his voice hoarse from disuse. "But you made it this far. That's got to mean something." He rose carefully and stepped back, leaving the door open. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the bigger wolf nudged the injured one forward, guiding it up the steps. Its movement was cautious, deliberate, its body coiled in case of a sudden threat. The smaller wolf hesitated at the edge of the porch, nose twitching. Jack moved to the side, giving them space. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, more to himself than them. "You've already had enough of that, I think." One more step, then another. The small wolf limped over the threshold. The warmth of the cabin hit it like a wave. It collapsed almost instantly, crumpling into a heap on the rug just inside the door. Jack startled but didn't approach. The bigger wolf stepped over it protectively, eyes still on Jack. There was no sound but the laboured breathing of the collapsed animal, the whisper of snow melting from their coats. For several long moments they simply stared at one another. Jack could feel the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders, heavy and impossible to shake. Finally he closed the door. The wind's howl vanished, muffled to a dull roar. The sudden stillness inside the cabin made Jack's ears ring. He turned slowly toward his unexpected guests. The wolves looked so out of place against the backdrop of his humble home, wooden shelves lined with canned goods, a kettle hissing softly over the fire, a hand-sewn quilt draped over the arm of his chair. And yet they didn't feel wrong. It was as if the forest had followed him home, tired and frost-bitten, and now sought warmth the only way it could. Jack approached the smaller wolf carefully. Its breathing was shallow, its eyes half-lidded in pain and exhaustion. Blood stained the fur around its paw, dark against the matted white. The bigger wolf growled low in its throat, but didn't move. "I have to look at the wound," Jack said softly. "I'm not going to hurt him." He stepped into the kitchen and returned with a basin of warm water, a clean towel and an old first aid kit that hadn't seen much use since Elena. He moved slowly, deliberately, narrating his actions in a calm, even tone. He wasn't sure if the wolf understood the words, but maybe the sound would help. He knelt beside the smaller wolf, dipped the towel into the water, and began to clean the blood away. The animal flinched, but didn't bite. Jack worked in silence, hands steady despite the tremor in his chest. The wound was a deep gash near the paw pad, likely from a trap or jagged ice. He rinsed it, applied antiseptic, and wrapped it with gauze and tape. All the while, the larger wolf sat close, muscles taut, breath huffing softly. "There," Jack whispered as he finished. "That should hold." He stood and stepped back, allowing the wolves space. The bigger one immediately lay down beside its injured companion, curling its body around the smaller wolf. It rested its head on its paws, eyes finally breaking away from Jack's for the first time since they arrived. Jack retreated to his chair by the fire, sinking into the cushions with a long exhale. His tea was cold. The cabin felt warmer, though, not because of the fire, because he wasn't alone anymore, and for the first time in years, he didn't mind. Here is the story exactly as you requested, with no changes to the wording. The latch felt like ice beneath Jack's fingers. He'd bolted this door every winter night for 12 years. 12 years of silence. 12 years of watching the snow pile up against the window panes like God was slowly burying him alive. His father's voice growled in his memory. "Wild things stay wild, boy. You feed a wolf today, it'll eat you tomorrow." Jack's breath fogged the thick glass as he peered out again. Here is the story exactly as you requested, with no changes to the wording. The latch felt like ice beneath Jack's fingers. He'd bolted this door every winter night for 12 years. 12 years of silence. 12 years of watching the snow pile up against the window panes like God was slowly burying him alive. His father's voice growled in his memory. "Wild things stay wild, boy. You feed a wolf today, it'll eat you tomorrow." Jack's breath fogged the thick glass as he peered out again. The wolves hadn't moved. The smaller one, a female he realized now, was shivering so hard her legs kept buckling. The male stood rigid beside her, his yellow eyes locked on Jack's shadow behind the window. Scratch! The sound clawed at something deep in Jack's chest. He looked down at his own hands. The scar across his knuckles from the axe slipped last winter, the dirt ground into his skin from yesterday's wood chopping. Hands that hadn't touched another living thing in... He couldn't remember. The male wolf suddenly threw back his head and screamed. Not a howl, a cry. It ripped through the blizzard's roar like a knife through canvas. Jack's spine turned to water. He'd heard that sound once before, the winter the grizzly got into his sheep pen. The ewes had made that same noise when their lambs... The female wolf collapsed. Jack moved before he could think. The door groaned open, unleashing a whirlwind of snow into the cabin. The male wolf's ears flattened. He bared his teeth but didn't lunge, just stood trembling over his fallen mate, a low growl rumbling in his chest. "Easy," Jack whispered, his voice rough from disuse. He knelt slowly, the cold floorboards biting through his jeans. "I'm not." The words died in his throat. Up close, he could see the female's ribs straining against her skin. Her belly was swollen in a way that had nothing to do with hunger, pregnant and dying. The realization hit Jack like a kick to the gut. He'd seen enough ewes in distress to recognize the signs, the labored breathing, the glazed eyes, the way her back legs kept twitching. The male wolf suddenly lunged, not at Jack but past him into the cabin. He skidded on the wooden floor, nails scrambling for purchase, then turned and stared at Jack with those terrible, knowing eyes. "Help us!" Jack's pulse hammered in his ears. Every survival instinct screamed at him to slam the door, bolt it, pour another whiskey and forget this ever happened. Wild wolves, pregnant female, in his home. Then the female whimpered, a sound so small it barely existed, and Jack was moving. He scooped her up, her fur matted with ice, her body frighteningly light in his arms. The male wolf shadowed his every step, breath hot on Jack's elbow as he carried her to the rag rug by the fire. "Gotta get you warm," Jack muttered, more to himself than the wolves. He grabbed the quilt off his bed, his mother's wedding quilt, the one he hadn't unfolded in years, and wrapped it around the shivering female. The male wolf circled twice, then lay down beside her, pressing his entire length against her back. His eyes never left Jack's face. The cabin smelled suddenly of wet fur and blood, and something earthy Jack couldn't name. The fire popped, sending up a shower of sparks. Outside, the wind screamed like a living thing. Jack knelt there, his knees going numb, watching the female's shallow breaths. Her nose was dry and cracked. When he reached out to touch it, the male wolf's growl vibrated through the floorboards. "I know," Jack said quietly. "I know." He stood slowly and went to the kitchen area. The venison stew he'd made yesterday still sat in the pot on the stove. He dumped it all into his mixing bowl, 3 days' worth of meals, and set it on the floor near the wolves. The male wolf's nostrils flared. He didn't move. Jack retreated to his rocking chair by the window, giving them space. He picked up his whittling knife and a block of pine, just to have something to do with his hands. The knife's familiar weight grounded him as the blizzard rattled the window panes. Minutes ticked by. Finally, with a sound like tearing fabric, the male wolf stood and approached the bowl. He ate fast, barely chewing, then immediately returned to the female's side and began licking her face with rough, urgent strokes. Jack watched, his knife stilling in his hand. The firelight painted the wolves in golden shadow, the male's scarred muzzle, the female's twitching ears, the way their tails curled together like 2 vines from the same root. The female suddenly convulsed, her whole body seizing. The male wolf whined, nosing at her neck. Jack was on his knees beside them before he'd made the decision to move. "Easy, girl," he murmured, hands hovering over her distended belly. He'd delivered dozens of lambs, but this... Her muscles contracted again, harder this time. A dark stain spread across the quilt beneath her. The male wolf met Jack's eyes and howled, a sound so full of grief it raised the hair on Jack's arms. Jack swallowed hard. "Okay," he breathed. "Okay." He ran to the bathroom for towels, his hunting knife, the bottle of rubbing alcohol he used for cuts. When he returned, the female's breathing had gone ragged. The male wolf was frantically licking her ears, as if he could somehow pour his own strength into her. Jack rolled up his sleeves, his hands shook. The wind slammed against the cabin like it wanted in. And Jack, lonely, broken Jack who hadn't touched another living soul since the funeral, began to deliver a wolf pup into the world. The fire popped as Jack knelt beside the shivering wolves, his cabin floorboards groaning under his weight. The pregnant female's breath came in shallow, uneven gasps, her ribs rising and falling like a broken bellows. The male, her mate, had stopped growling, but his golden eyes tracked Jack's every movement, pupils wide and black in the firelight. Jack hesitated, his hands hovering over her swollen belly. He'd helped birth lambs before, but never a wolf. Never something this wild, this dangerous. Then the female convulsed again, a wet guttural sound escaping her throat. No time. Jack grabbed the cleanest towel he had, an old flannel shirt from the back of his closet, and pressed it between her hind legs. The fabric darkened immediately. "Easy, girl," he murmured, more to himself than to her. His voice sounded foreign in his own ears, rough from disuse. "Just take it slow." The male wolf whined, pressing his muzzle against his mate's neck. She didn't respond. Jack's pulse hammered. He'd seen enough livestock in distress to know this wasn't right. The contractions were too weak, too far apart. She was exhausted, starving. And if he didn't do something, another spasm racked her body. This time, something dark and slick slid partway out before stopping. Stuck. Jack's stomach lurched. He'd seen this once before, years ago, with one of his neighbour's sheep. The lamb had been turned wrong, its shoulders wedged in the birth canal. By the time they'd realised, it was too late for both mother and baby. The memory sent a chill down his spine. The male wolf suddenly stood, his nose inches from Jack's face. Hot breath fogged against Jack's skin, carrying the iron scent of blood. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then slowly, the wolf lowered his head and licked Jack's trembling fingers. A plea, a trust. Jack swallowed hard. "All right," he whispered. "All right." He reached for his hunting knife, the blade glinting in the firelight. The male wolf tensed but didn't stop him as Jack carefully cut away the fur around the female's vulva, clearing space to see. The smell of blood and amniotic fluid filled the cabin, thick and coppery. The pup was halfway out, its tiny muzzle visible, but its shoulders were twisted. Jack's fingers shook as he gripped the slippery body. "Come on," he breathed. He pulled gently, adjusting the angle as he went. The female whimpered, her legs kicking weakly. The male paced behind Jack, his claws clicking against the floorboards. Then, a wet, sliding release. The pup tumbled into Jack's palms, limp and silent. No. Jack wiped the tiny body clean, rubbing its chest with the flannel shirt. No breath, no heartbeat. The pup's fur was jet black, its eyes still sealed shut. The female lifted her head weakly, sniffing the air. Jack's throat tightened. He'd failed. Then, a cough, a gasp. The pup twitched in his hands, its tiny mouth opening in a soundless cry. Jack nearly dropped it. The male wolf shoved past him, licking frantically at the newborn, cleaning its face, its ears, its wrinkled body. The female managed to roll onto her side, her tongue flicking out to greet her pup for the first time. Jack sat back on his heels, his hands sticky with blood and afterbirth. His breath came in ragged bursts, his shirt clinging to his back with sweat. The pup, alive, impossibly alive, squirmed toward its mother's belly, nosing blindly for milk. The female winced as it latched on, but she didn't pull away. The male wolf turned to Jack. For a long moment they just looked at each other. Then the wolf stepped forward and pressed his forehead against Jack's knee. A thank you, a bond. Jack reached out, his fingers sinking into the thick fur behind the wolf's ears. The animal didn't flinch, didn't growl, just leaned into the touch, his breath warm against Jack's leg. Outside, the storm raged on, but in the cabin, for the first time in years, Jack didn't feel alone. The first morning. Dawn crept through the cabin windows in pale, hesitant streaks, painting the wolves in shades of silver and gold. Jack stirred from where he'd fallen asleep, propped against the wall, his neck stiff and his fingers still faintly sticky with blood. The male wolf was already awake. He stood at the foot of the rag rug, watching Jack with those unblinking yellow eyes. The female lay curled around her pup, her breathing slow and even. The little one, black as a... The first morning. Dawn crept through the cabin windows in pale, hesitant streaks, painting the wolves in shades of silver and gold. Jack stirred from where he'd fallen asleep, propped against the wall, his neck stiff and his fingers still faintly sticky with blood. The male wolf was already awake. He stood at the foot of the rag rug, watching Jack with those unblinking yellow eyes. The female lay curled around her pup, her breathing slow and even. The little one, black as a moonless night, nuzzled blindly against her belly, his tiny paws kneading her fur. Jack held his breath. The male wolf took a single step forward, then another. His claws clicked softly against the wooden floor. Jack didn't move, The wolf stopped just out of arm's reach. His nostrils flared, taking in Jack's scent, sweat and pine soap and the lingering iron of last night's ordeal. For a long moment, neither breathed. Then the wolf lowered his head and licked Jack's boot. Just once. A thank you. A promise. Jack exhaled shakily. "You're welcome," he whispered. The wolf tilted his head, ears twitching at the sound of Jack's voice. Then he turned and padded back to his family, circling twice before settling beside them with a sigh. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving the world hushed and glittering. Jack smiled. The naming. By the third day, Jack had started calling them in his head. The male was Shadow, for the way he moved, silent and smooth, always just at the edge of Jack's vision. The female was Dawn, because her fur held the soft colours of a winter sunrise, pale gold at the tips, deepening to rich brown at the roots. The pup, Jack hesitated. He'd never named something that wasn't his, but when the little one stumbled into his lap one evening, squeaking in protest when Jack lifted him back to his mother, the word came unbidden. Rascal! Dawn huffed, as if in agreement. Shadow thumped his tail once against the floor, and just like that, they weren't just wolves anymore. They were his. The lessons. Jack learned their language slowly. A flick of Shadow's ears meant someone's outside. Dawn's low growl was reserved for the occasional snowshoe hare that ventured too close to the cabin. Rascal, still wobbling on unsteady legs, had only two settings: play and sleep. Jack woke one morning to find the pup gnawing on his bootlaces, tiny teeth scraping against the leather. When he reached down to disentangle him, Rascal latched onto his finger instead, gums clamping down with surprising strength. "Oh, no." Dawn lifted her head lazily, watching as Jack pried the pup loose. Rascal yipped, tail wagging furiously, before launching himself at Jack's sleeve. Shadow, stretched out by the fire, let out a sound that was almost a laugh. Jack groaned. "You think this is funny?" Shadow blinked innocently. Dawn yawned. Rascal pounced on Jack's shoelace again. Jack sighed and let him. The hunt. A week in, Shadow started bringing gifts. A mangled snowshoe hare appeared on the porch one morning, its fur still stiff with frost. A grouse followed 2 days later, its feathers ruffled and its neck neatly broken. Jack stared at the offerings, unsure what to do. Shadow sat patiently, tail sweeping the snow, until Jack gathered the carcasses and carried them inside. That night, Jack cooked the grouse, his first fresh meat in weeks, and shared the scraps with the wolves. Shadow took his piece delicately, his rough tongue brushing Jack's fingertips. Dawn licked her chops and nudged Rascal toward the food. The pup, more interested in chewing Jack's boot, ignored her. Jack chuckled and tossed him a bite anyway. Rascal caught it mid-air, swallowing without chewing, before promptly face-planting into the rug. Shadow sighed. Dawn licked the top of his fuzzy head. Jack rubbed his aching ribs from laughter, not loneliness, and realized he couldn't remember the last time he'd felt this light. The boundary. Not everything was easy. Shadow still tensed when Jack reached for Dawn too quickly. Dawn growled low in her throat if Jack lingered near Rascal while he nursed. And Rascal, curious and fearless, had no concept of personal space. Jack learned to move slowly, to let them come to him, to ask instead of take. One evening, as he knelt to refill their water bowl, Shadow suddenly blocked his path, his body rigid. Jack froze. For a heartbeat, they stood locked in silence, man and wolf, neither backing down. Then Shadow stepped aside, not in submission, in trust. Jack exhaled and set the bowl down carefully. Shadow watched him, his gaze unreadable, before dipping his head to drink. Jack reached out, hesitated, then let his fingers brush the wolf's shoulder. Shadow didn't pull away. Directed at some unseen threat outside, felt like part of the rhythm now. Jack found himself talking to them, not the half-hearted mutterings he'd used to fill the silence before, but real conversations. "Think we'll get more snow?" He'd ask, peering out the window. Shadow would flick an ear. Dawn would yawn. Rascal would try to eat his pant leg. It was enough. The gift. The blizzard returned on the 14th night. Wind howled through the trees, rattling the window panes and sending drafts snaking across the floor. Jack stoked the fire higher, watching as the wolves arranged themselves in their usual spots. Shadow and Dawn curled around Rascal, their bodies shielding him from the cold. Jack draped an extra blanket over them, his fingers lingering in Dawn's fur. She licked his wrist once before tucking her nose under her tail. Shadow watched him, his golden eyes reflecting the firelight. Then, deliberately, he stood and nudged Jack's knee. Jack frowned. What? Shadow huffed and trotted to the rug by the hearth, Jack's spot, before lying down and stretching out, leaving just enough space beside him. An invitation. Jack's throat tightened. He crossed the cabin slowly, his socked feet whispering against the floorboards. Shadow didn't move as Jack settled beside him, close enough to feel the wolf's warmth but not quite touching. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, the fire crackled. Rascal let out a tiny snore, and Jack, for the first time in longer than he could remember, didn't feel the cold. The first sign. The morning dawned brittle and bright, sunlight glaring off the snowbanks piled against the cabin. Jack stood at the window, steaming coffee in hand, watching Shadow patrol the tree line like a sentinel. The big wolf moved with purpose, nose to the ground, tail stiff. Something had his attention. Jack frowned and set his mug down. Dawn, curled by the fire with Rascal dozing against her belly, lifted her head when the door creaked open. Cold air rushed in, making the pup whine and burrow deeper into her fur. "Stay," Jack murmured, though he knew she wouldn't listen. Shadow had vanished into the pines. Jack grabbed his coat and followed. The tracks. The forest swallowed sound. Jack's boots crunched through the crusted snow, breath fogging in the still air. Shadow's paw prints wove between the trees, deeper and more frantic than usual. Then Jack saw them. Other tracks. Older, larger. The stride uneven, as if the animal was limping. His stomach tightened. Another wolf. Shadow stood frozen ahead, his hackles raised, staring at something Jack couldn't see. A low growl rumbled in his chest, not threatening. Worried, Jack moved closer, twigs snapping underfoot. Shadow didn't turn. His entire body was taut, ears pricked forward. Then from the shadows between the trees, a whimper. Soft, broken, the sound of something dying. She was half buried in a drift, her grey fur matted with ice. Old, so old. Her ribs jutted like barrel staves beneath her patchy coat, and one hind leg twisted at an unnatural angle, long healed wrong. Milky cataracts clouded her left eye, but the right locked onto Shadow with startling intensity. Jack's breath caught. The ancient wolf tried to rise, failed, and collapsed back into the snow with a shuddering sigh. Shadow whined and took a step forward. The old wolf bared yellowed teeth. A warning. A plea. Jack understood then. This wasn't just any wolf. This was family. The decision. Jack approached slowly, hands raised. The old wolf's growl deepened, her one good eye tracking his every move. Shadow stayed rooted in place, trembling. "It's okay," Jack murmured, more to himself than to them. "I'm not going to hurt you." The wolf's lips peeled back further, revealing worn canines. Jack knelt an arm's length away, snow soaking through his jeans. Up close he could smell the infection on her, old wounds gone sour, sickness festering in her lungs. She wouldn't last the night out here. Shadow made a sound Jack had never heard before, half howl, half whine, and suddenly darted forward, licking the old wolf's face with frantic strokes. She snapped at him weakly, but Shadow didn't stop. Jack swallowed hard. Then he shrugged out of his coat. The carry. She fought. Of course she fought. When Jack slid his arms beneath her, the old wolf twisted with surprising strength, her teeth grazing his wrist. Shadow danced around them, whining as Jack gritted his teeth and lifted. She was lighter than he expected, all bones and matted fur, but the weight of her pride was crushing. "Easy," Jack breathed as she thrashed. "I've got you." Her claws raked his shirt, drawing blood. Shadow barked sharply. The old wolf stilled. For one endless moment, man and beast stared at each other, her panting breaths fogging between them. Then, with a shuddering sigh, she went limp in Jack's arms. Not surrender. Trust. Jack's throat tightened as he adjusted his grip and started back toward the cabin. Shadow led the way, glancing back every few steps as if to make sure they were still following. Behind them, the old wolf's uneven breaths warmed Jack's neck, and for the first time since he'd found her, she didn't struggle. The return. Dawn was waiting at the door. She took one look at the bundle in Jack's arms and howled, a sound that raised the hair on Jack's neck. Rascal tumbled over his own feet, trying to see. his tiny nose twitching at the new scent. Jack stepped inside and gently laid the old wolf by the fire. Dawn was on her in an instant, sniffing every inch, licking her face with desperate urgency. The old wolf tolerated it for exactly 3 seconds before growling and snapping. A clear enough. Shadow nudged Dawn back and lay down beside the newcomer, his body pressed flush against hers. Rascal, ever fearless, wobbled over and promptly tried to climb onto her back. The old wolf turned her head and gave him one withering look. Rascal froze, then slowly, deliberately, backed away. Jack choked on a laugh. Even half dead, this wolf commanded respect. The care. She refused to eat at first. Jack tried venison stew, raw rabbit, even the last of his bacon. The old wolf turned her nose up at everything, watching him with that unblinking right eye. Shadow finally solved the problem by chewing a piece of meat himself, then spitting it at her feet like an offering. She ate after that, slowly, deliberately, like she was doing them a favor. Jack cleaned her wounds as best he could, the oozing cut on her shoulder, the cracked pads of her paws. She bore his ministrations with stoic patience, only growling when the alcohol stung too much. When he finished, she licked his hand once, briefly, almost like she hadn't meant to. Jack pretended not to notice. The revelation. That night, Jack dreamed of wolves, a pack running through snow, their breath steaming in the cold, Shadow young and unscarred, Dawn sleek with pregnancy, and at the lead, the old wolf, strong and straight-backed, her howl splitting the night. Jack woke with a start. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the cabin. The old wolf was watching him, really watching him, not with suspicion, not with fear, with recognition. Jack's breath caught, because in that moment he knew. She remembered him from the dream, and somehow, impossibly, he remembered her. The naming. At dawn, Jack knew what to call her. Elder, not for her age, for her spirit. Shadow huffed in approval. Dawn licked the old wolf's ears, and Rascal, ever the opportunist, stole a bite of her breakfast when she wasn't looking. Elder pinned him with a look that promised retribution. Rascal hid behind Jack's boot, and for the first time since they'd found her, Elder's tail thumped once against the floor, almost like laughter. The understanding. Days passed. Not completely. Her leg would always drag, her eye would never clear, but her ribs disappeared beneath new muscle, and her coat grew glossy with health. She never begged, never whined. But sometimes, when she thought Jack wasn't looking, she'd press her nose to his palm and breathe deep, as if memorizing his scent. Shadow followed her like a shadow. Dawn deferred to her at mealtimes. Even Rascal minded his manners, mostly. And Jack learned the most important lesson of all. Some bonds aren't chosen. They're remembered. The call of blood. The wind carried the scent of pine and frozen earth as Jack knelt beside the trail of broken ice. The tracks were fresh, less than an hour old, but already the edges had begun to soften under the morning sun. Shadow stood rigid beside him, his nostrils flaring as he inhaled the story written in snow. Blood. Not much. Just a few dark drops staining the white powder like scattered berries, but enough to make Jack's pulse quicken. Dawn whined low in her throat, pressing against his leg. Even Rascal, usually bouncing with puppy energy, sat quiet at Jack's feet, his ears pinned back. Elder was gone, not wandered off, not hunting. Gone, and she'd left a trail. The first clue! Jack found the tuft of grey fur snagged on a hawthorn branch. It glimmered in the weak sunlight, the strands coarse between his fingers. Smart, he murmured. Elder had marked her path. For them. For him. Shadow sniffed the fur, then turned his golden eyes on Jack. The message was clear. Follow. Jack adjusted his pack, filled with bandages, dried meat, and the last of his medicinal salve, and stepped into the trees. The forest swallowed them whole. The silent march. They moved like ghosts through the pines. Shadow took point, his body low and fluid between the trunks. Dawn kept pace at Jack's side, her ears swiveling at every creak of branches. Even Rascal trotted silently for once, his nose glued to Elder's scent trail. The blood spots grew more frequent. Jack's stomach twisted. Elder was hurt, worse than he'd thought. A sudden gust brought the metallic tang of fresh blood to his nose. Shadow froze, one paw lifted mid-step. Then he ran. The ravine opened up without warning, a jagged tear in the earth half filled with drifted snow. At the bottom, curled in the roots of a fallen spruce, lay Elder. Her breathing came in shallow rasps, her flank dark and matted. A gash ran along her ribs, the fur round it stiff with frozen blood. Jack slid down the slope, snow filling his boots. Elder lifted her head weakly when he approached, her one good eye glazed with pain. But when Shadow tried to lick her face, she snarled and snapped, not at him, but at the trees beyond. Danger! Jack's hand went to his knife. Then he saw them. The enemy wolf tracks, but not like Shadow's. These were larger, deeper. The claws had left brutal gouges in the snow, and they circled Elder's hiding place like vultures. Jack's blood turned to ice. Rogues, lone wolves without a pack, desperate, hungry, and they'd marked Elder as prey. Shadow's growl vibrated through Jack's boots as he positioned himself between Elder and the unseen threat. Dawn herded Rascal behind her, her lips peeled back in a silent snarl. The forest held its breath. Then a twig snapped. The standoff. He emerged from the shadows like a nightmare given form, bigger than Shadow, thicker across the shoulders. His muzzle was crisscrossed with old scars, and one ear had been torn to shreds. But his eyes, yellow and pitiless, locked onto Elder with terrifying focus. Jack's knife felt small in his hand. The rogue took a step forward. Shadow met him halfway. For a heartbeat, the two males stood nose to nose, their breaths mingling in the cold air. The rogue's lips curled, revealing broken teeth. Shadow didn't flinch. Then everything happened at once.
The fight.
The rogue lunged. Shadow twisted aside at the last second, his teeth scoring the other wolf's flank. They came together in a whirl of fur and snapping jaws, their snarls echoing off the ravine walls. Dawn shoved Rascal toward Jack, then leapt into the fray. Jack moved on instinct. He grabbed Rascal by the scruff and thrust him into the hollow beneath the spruce roots with Elder. "Stay!" Then he turned, knife raised, just as the rogue broke free and charged. Straight at him. The wound. Pain exploded in Jack's thigh. The rogue's teeth tore through his pants like paper, hot blood instantly soaking the fabric. Jack swung wildly, the knife blade glancing off the wolf's shoulder. It wasn't enough. The rogue reared back for another strike, then Shadow hit him like a battering ram. They went down in a snarling heap, rolling through the snow in a blur of teeth and claws. Dawn darted in, her own fangs sinking into the rogue's hind leg. The rogue howled in rage and ran. The aftermath. Silence. Jack slumped against the spruce, his leg on fire. Shadow limped to his side, one ear bleeding freely. Dawn's muzzle was streaked red, but her eyes were bright with victory. Rascal wriggled out from the roots and promptly pounced on a clump of bloody snow. Elder huffed. Then impossibly she stood. Her legs shook, her wound still seeped. But when she looked at Jack, there was no pain in her gaze, only pride. Shadow nosed Jack's bleeding thigh, whining softly. "Yeah," Jack grimaced. "Hurts like hell." Elder took a step forward, then another, toward home. Jack laughed through the pain and pushed himself upright. "All right, old girl, lead the way." And together, bloodied but unbroken, they left the trail of broken ice behind. The return. The cabin door groaned open, ushering in the scent of blood and winter. Jack limped inside, his torn pant legs stiff with frozen gore. Behind him, the wolves moved like shadows. Shadow supporting Elder's slow steps, Dawn herding Rascal away from the fascinating red droplets Jack left in the snow. The fire had burned low in their absence. Jack collapsed into his chair, his hands shaking as he reached for the medical kit. The wound in his thigh pulsed with every heartbeat, hot and insistent. Shadow whined, nudging Jack's knee with his wet nose. "Yeah, I know," Jack muttered, fingers fumbling with the kit's latch. "Gotta clean it." Elder sank onto the hearthrug with a groan, her ribs rising and falling too fast. Rascal immediately clambered onto her back, oblivious to her pain. For once she didn't snap at him, just sighed and rested her chin on her paws. Dawn licked at Shadow's torn ear, her tongue staining pink with blood. And Jack realized he was smiling. The stitching! The needle glinted in the firelight as Jack sterilized it with whiskey, his own, the good bottle he'd been saving. "Waste of decent liquor," he grumbled, tipping another splash over his thigh. The burn made his vision whiten. Shadow pressed his full weight against Jack's good leg, a silent anchor. Jack threaded the needle. The first stitch pulled a hiss through his teeth. The second, a curse. By the third, sweat dripped down his temples. Then, a warm weight settled across his feet. Elder. She laid her head on his boot, her good eye watching the needle's progress with clinical interest. When Jack gasped at a particularly deep stitch, she huffed and nipped his shoelace. Jack laughed weakly. Bossy old woman. Elder's tail thumped once. 27 stitches later, the wound was closed. The vigil. Night fell heavy around the cabin. Jack drowsed in his chair, his leg propped on a pillow, the whiskey dulling the edges of his pain. The wolves formed a living blanket around him. Shadow curled against his left side, Dawn draped over his feet, Rascal snoring in the hollow between his arm and chest. Elder kept watch. From her post by the door, her ears twitched at every night sound, her gaze sharp even in the dark. The wound on her ribs had been cleaned and bandaged, but she refused to rest. Not yet. Not while the rogue might still be out there. Jack understood. He'd stood similar vigils. For his father, for his mother, for the life he'd thought he wanted. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows over the walls. Somewhere in the night an owl called. Elder's head lifted. Then, slowly, she limped to Jack's side and laid down with a sigh, her spine pressed against his chair leg. Guard duty could wait. Tonight, they were all safe. The dawn, morning light revealed the damage in full. Jack's leg was swollen and angry. Shadow's ear would heal crooked. Elder's stitches pulled with every breath, but they were alive. Jack crumbled the last of his painkillers into the wolves' breakfast, a shared act of rebellion against their wounds. Even Elder didn't protest when he slipped the powder into her meat. Rascal, untouched by the battle, bounced around their legs, stealing bites from whoever let their guard down. When he tried to snatch a piece from Elder, she pinned him with one paw and licked his face until he yowled. Shadow watched from the porch, his tail wagging at the sight. Jack joined him, leaning on the railing. The morning was crisp and still, the snow unbroken for miles. No rogue tracks, no threats, just peace. Shadow leaned against Jack's bad leg, support, not pressure. Jack scratched behind the wolf's good ear. "We did all right, huh?" Shadow sneezed in agreement. The understanding, by week's end, the rhythms of healing settled over them. Jack changed bandages. Elder tolerated his fussing with regal disdain. Dawn kept Rascal from reopening anyone's wounds with his enthusiasm. And Shadow never left Jack's side, not when Jack limped to the woodpile, not when he soaked his stitches in salt water, not even when he used the outhouse, much to Jack's exasperation. "You're worse than a nursemaid," Jack grumbled one evening as Shadow blocked him from standing on his injured leg too long. Shadow yawned, showing all his teeth. Elder snorted from her spot by the fire. Jack threw a biscuit at her. She caught it mid-air without opening her eyes. Rascal, predictably, lost his mind at the sight of flying food and launched himself at Jack's lap. Jack caught him with a grunt, the pup's enthusiastic licks washing his chin. All right, I surrender." Dawn sighed and dragged Rascal away by his scruff. Shadow rested his head on Jack's knee, and Jack realized he'd never been happier. The gift. The dream came again on the solstice. Jack stood in a snowfield under a sky blazing with stars. Before him stretched a wolf pack, dozens of them, their coats shimmering like liquid moonlight. At their head stood Elder, but not as he knew her. Young, strong, her fur thick and unmarred, her body straight and powerful. She met his eyes and howled, a sound that vibrated in Jack's bones. The pack answered. Then they ran, not away. Together. Jack woke, with tears on his cheeks. The fire had burned to embers. The wolves were gone. No, not gone, waiting. On the porch, 4 silhouettes stood outlined in dawn light. Shadow, Dawn, Rascal. And Elder, her head high, her gaze fixed on the eastern tree line. Jack pulled on his coat and joined them. The snow stretched before them, pristine and endless. Elder looked at him, then at the wild, then back at him. The choice was his. Jack took a deep breath and stepped forward. The arrival. The truck's engine growled through the trees, sending a flock of snow sparrows scattering into the dawn sky. Jack stood on the porch, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, watching the plume of exhaust curl against the pale morning light. Shadow pressed against his leg, his ears flicking at the unfamiliar sound. Dawn lingered in the doorway, her body blocking Rascal from darting outside. Only Elder remained still, perched on the top step like a weathered sentinel, her gaze fixed on the approaching vehicle. The tires crunched over frozen gravel as the wildlife rescue truck rolled to a stop. 2 figures stepped out, their breath fogging in the cold air. "Jack?" The woman, Kara, according to her earlier radio call, lifted a hand in greeting. We got here as fast as we could. Jack's throat tightened. He nodded. This was it. Time to say goodbye. The preparation. Kara moved with quiet efficiency, unloading supplies from the truck, a large crate, medical kits, thick gloves. Her partner, a rangy man named Micah, eyed the wolves warily. They're really just living with you? Jack didn't answer. He didn't need to. Shadow growled low in his throat as Kara approached, his hackles rising. Easy, Jack murmured, resting a hand on the wolf's scruff. She's here to help. Kara knelt a respectful distance away, letting the wolves scent her. The male's the protective one, I take it? That's Shadow, Jack's voice roughened. The female's Dawn, the pup's Rascal. And Elder. Kara's gaze landed on the old wolf, her eyes widening. My God, she's magnificent. Elder stared back, unimpressed. The crate yawned open like a mouth. Jack had known this moment was coming, had prepared for it, but now that it was here, his body refused to cooperate. His feet stayed rooted to the porch steps as Kara and Micah began guiding the wolves toward the truck. Dawn went first, her ears pinned back but her steps steady. She paused once to look over her shoulder at Jack, her golden eyes full of unspoken trust. Rascal bounded after her, too excited by the new adventure to understand. Shadow refused. He planted himself at Jack's side, his body rigid, his lips curled in a silent snarl. Even when Jack urged him forward, the wolf wouldn't budge. Kara exchanged a glance with Micah. We might need the tranquilizer. No, Jack crouched, his forehead pressing against Shadow's. It's okay, he whispered. You have to go. The wolf whined, a sound that speared straight through Jack's ribs. Then, slowly, Shadow turned and followed Dawn into the crate. Only Elder remained. She hadn't moved from her spot on the porch, her gaze drifting between Jack and the truck. Kara hesitated. We can sedate her if... No. Jack swallowed hard. Let me. He knelt before the old wolf, his knees cracking against the frozen wood. Elder studied him, her one good eye gleaming with ancient knowing. You stubborn old girl, Jack murmured, his voice breaking. Elder huffed. Then, with deliberate slowness, she leaned forward and pressed her muzzle to his chest, right over his heart. A gift. A goodbye. Jack's hands trembled as he scooped her up, her weight familiar against his arms. He carried her to the crate, his steps measured, his breath coming too fast. When he set her down beside Shadow, Elder didn't look back. She never did. The silence. The truck doors slammed shut. The engine roared to life. Jack stood in the yard, the cold seeping through his boots, watching as the wolves he'd saved, the family he'd found, disappeared down the road in a cloud of exhaust. The cabin loomed behind him, suddenly too big, too quiet. No more Rascal tumbling underfoot. No more Dawn's quiet sighs by the fire. No more Shadow's weight against his leg. No more Elder's knowing gaze. Just silence and snow. And the echo of paws that would never walk these floors again. Jack sank onto the porch steps, his face in his hands. The wind howled through the trees, a sound almost like wolves singing. Almost, but not quite. The first night. The fire had burned down to embers. Jack sat alone in his rocking chair, staring at the empty rug where Shadow used to sprawl, his massive paws twitching in sleep. The cabin creaked around him. The same sounds that had once been comforting now echoed like gunshots in the silence. He reached for the whiskey bottle, then stopped. No, not tonight. Tonight, he wanted to feel every second of this. Outside, the wind howled through the pines. For the first time in months, Jack didn't imagine wolves answering. The ghosts. Morning light revealed the remnants of their presence. Tufts of grey fur caught in the floorboards. Scratches on the doorframe from Rascal's enthusiastic greetings. A single weathered paw print preserved in dried mud by the hearth. Jack left them all untouched. He made coffee for one. The pot seemed absurdly large in his hands. When he sipped from his chipped mug, the bitterness lingered on his tongue. No Rascal begging for a taste. No Dawn nudging his elbow in quiet demand. The bacon sizzled in the pan, its rich aroma filling the cabin. Jack stared at the 4 strips, then, out of habit, cooked 2 more. He ate them all himself. The grease tasted like guilt. The walk. Snow crunched under Jack's boots as he trudged to the woodpile. His breath fogged in the air, each exhale a ghost of warmth in the frozen stillness. He half expected to see Shadow trotting beside him, his golden eyes scanning the tree line for threats. But there was only snow, only silence. Jack's axe bit into the log with more force than necessary, the impact vibrating up his arms. He split wood until his muscles burned and his palms blistered, until the physical pain drowned out the other kind. When he finally stopped, the winter sun hung low in the sky, painting the snow in shades of rose and gold. Jack tilted his face to the light and closed his eyes. Somewhere, under this same sky, his wolves were running free. The thought should have comforted him. The dream. He woke gasping. The cabin was dark, the fire reduced to glowing coals. For a heartbeat, Jack could have sworn he felt warm fur pressed against his legs, could have sworn he heard the familiar huff of Shadow's breath. But the rug was empty. The only sound was the wind whispering through the cracks in the logs. Jack dragged a hand down his face, his skin damp with sweat. He'd dreamed of them, not as they were now, but as they might be. Shadow leading a new pack through moonlit snow, Dawn teaching Rascal to hunt. Elder watching over them all, her gaze as sharp as ever. The dream had felt so real. Jack's chest ached. He stoked the fire until flames leaped high, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Then he pulled a chair close and sat, staring into the blaze until dawn painted the sky. The gift. A week passed. Then 2. The cabin stayed silent, but the woods began to speak again. A fresh set of tracks near the stream, not wolves, but a lone fox. The return of the chickadees, their cheerful calls piercing the cold. And one morning, as Jack stepped onto the porch, he found it. A perfect rabbit carcass laid neatly by the door. Fresh, untouched. Jack knelt, his fingers brushing the soft fur. No teeth marks, no claw wounds, just a single precise bite to the neck, the kind Shadow used to make. His throat closed. It couldn't be. The wildlife centre was miles away. The wolves had been released deep in the protected reserve. But as Jack lifted the rabbit, something fluttered to the ground, a single jet-black feather. Rascal had always been obsessed with them. Jack's hands shook as he tucked the feather into his pocket. Then he smiled. Winter loosened its grip. Snow melted into mud. Icicles dripped from the eaves. And one evening, as Jack sat on the porch with a mug of tea, he heard it. A howl. Distant. Haunting. Unmistakable. Jack froze, the mug halfway to his lips. The sound came again, closer this time, joined by 2 higher voices and one deep familiar call. His breath caught. They were home. Not his wolves. Not anymore. But a pack. Wild. Free. Alive. Jack set the mug down and tilted his head back, letting the music of their voices wash over him. The howls rose and fell, weaving through the trees like a song only he could understand. When they faded at last, the silence didn't feel so heavy anymore. Jack stood and went inside. The hearth waited, its embers still glowing. He added a log, watched it catch, and for the first time since they'd left, the fire burned bright.